Franklin's hand closed around Mara's wrist like a trap snapping shut. He didn't ask. He didn't warn her. He simply grabbed her in the middle of the hallway, yanked her off her feet, and dragged her toward the restroom door at the back of the corridor like she weighed nothing, like she was something he owned. She stumbled. Her tray hit the floor. Nobody in the dining room turned around. Nobody moved. And Franklin, smiling the way a man smiles when he knows there are no consequences, leaned down and whispered something into her ear that made the color drain from her face completely. What he didn't know was that someone had been watching him all night. Someone who never forgot a face. Someone who never let anything go unpunished. If this story already has your heart pounding, subscribe to our channel right now, hit the notification bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Mara Chen had spent most of her 22 years learning how to disappear. Not literally, she wasn't the kind of person who ran from things, not exactly, but she had mastered the particular art of becoming invisible in a room full of people. Small voice, careful steps, eyes that stayed low. At Laura, one of the most expensive restaurants on Chicago's North Shore, being invisible was practically a survival skill. The clientele came in with money and with attitude, and the staff who lasted longest were the ones who learned to absorb both without flinching. She had lasted 14 months. That was longer than most. Laura was the kind of place that made the covers of food magazines, crystal stemware, tablecloths that cost more than Mara's rent, a sommelier who spoke in a low, reverent voice about grapes the way priests spoke about scripture. The kitchen ran like a machine, the service was choreographed, and every Friday night, the private bar in the back filled up with the kind of men whose names you saw on buildings. Men who never raised their voices because they never needed to. Men who got what they wanted by simply existing in a room. Mara had noticed the discrepancies 6 months ago. It had started small, a billing entry that didn't match what she'd rung, and a receipt that came out of the printer with a tip she hadn't entered a charge for a bottle of wine that had never left the cellar. She'd flagged the first one to her supervisor. Her supervisor had smiled and told her the system had quirks. She'd flagged the second one to the shift lead. The shift lead had looked at her with flat, careful eyes and said, "Just let it go, Mara." She had let it go. For months she had let it go. She told herself it wasn't her business, that she didn't understand how restaurant accounting worked at that level, that she was probably missing something. But the discrepancies kept appearing, and they kept growing, and Mara Chen, despite every instinct telling her to stay quiet, could not stop adding them up in her head. Franklin Marsh had been the restaurant manager for 3 years. He was 41, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy confidence that came from knowing he had never been held accountable for anything in his life. He remembered every employee's name, their schedules, their weak points. He had a gift for making people feel like they owed him something. With the regular staff, he was loud laughing, slapping backs. With Mara, he was always slightly too close, always watching her just a beat longer than he should have. She had figured out sometime around the 5th month that the fraud wasn't random. It was a system. Franklin was running it, and at least 4 other employees were in on it, 2 at the register. One in the kitchen, one who handled the end-of-night reconciliation reports. The scheme was elegant in a dirty way. Fake tip entries on tables that paid cash. Alcohol logged as sold but never taken from inventory, the difference pocketed. Charges added to credit card bills after customers had already signed small enough that most people never noticed, large enough that across a full week of sittings, the total was staggering. Mara had done the rough math in a notebook she kept at home. In a good month, Franklin and his crew were pulling close to $40,000 out of the restaurant that wasn't theirs. She had not reported it. She was ashamed of that now, standing in the hallway with the echo of the crash her tray had made still ringing in her ears, her wrist burning where Franklin's hand had been. But she was 22 and she needed the arm, and she had spent every year of her life being told that the people who stepped out of line were the ones who got hurt. The restroom door was 10 feet away. Franklin was already moving toward it, not looking back at her, the way a man moves when he's sure the thing he's dragging will follow. "I'm not going in there," Mara said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She hadn't planned to speak. The words just arrived. Franklin stopped. He turned slowly like a man who has been mildly inconvenienced and intends to address it. His face was still in that easy smile configuration, but something had shifted behind his eyes. "Excuse me. I said I'm not going in there." She was shaking. She could feel it in her Knees, that particular vibration that came when her body was preparing to run, even though her feet weren't moving. Franklin, I need to talk to you about the receipts from last Friday. Table 22, the Donovan party. They were charged for 2 bottles of Chateau Margaux that I know for a fact were never opened. The smile didn't disappear. It crystallized. We can discuss that inside. We can discuss it here. He took a step toward her. She took a step back. Her shoulder blade found the wall behind her, and she had nowhere left to go. And Franklin leaned in close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne he wore and the scotch underneath it. And he said very quietly, "Mara, I like you. I've always liked you. Don't make this something it doesn't have to be." "I'm not making it anything. I'm asking you a straightforward question. And I'm telling you we'll have that conversation in private." His hand found her arm, not the wrist, this time the upper arm, and the grip was different, harder. "You're a smart girl, smart enough to know that the people who ask too many questions around here tend to find their hours cut, or their shifts eliminated entirely. You understand what I'm saying to you?" She did understand. She understood exactly. And for a moment, a brief, terrible moment, she almost capitulated, almost nodded, almost let him steer her through that door, let him deliver whatever threat he'd prepared, and walked back out to her tables and spent the rest of the night pretending she'd never added up those numbers. The math of survival was seductive. She knew it well. But something had shifted in her tonight. Something that had been building for 6 months had finally reached a pressure it could no longer contain. Maybe it was the Donovan party. She had liked them, an older couple celebrating something. The husband had a hearing aid and kept leaning toward his wife to catch what she said, and they'd left her a $20 tip in cash that Franklin had entered into the system as 60. Taking from the restaurant was one thing. Taking from a table that had been genuinely generous, altering the number on their bill, after they'd already trusted the process, something about that had crossed a line it awed her that she hadn't known was there until it was crossed. "Let go of my arm," she said. Franklin's grip tightened. "Let go of my arm, Franklin. You need to calm down." "I'm completely calm." And she was, which was the strangest part. The shaking in her knees had stopped. Her voice had gone flat and clear. "And I'm not going anywhere with you. If you want to have a conversation about why your billing records don't match inventory for the last 6 months, we can do that right here in this hallway, or we can do it with the owner present, but we are not doing it in a bathroom." The easy smile was gone now. What replaced it was something colder and more honest. "You think you know something," he said. "You don't know anything. You're a waitress. You carry plates and you take orders and you smell at tables. That's the entire scope of your relevance here. Do you understand me?" "I understand you perfectly." "Good. Then you understand that whatever you think you've figured out, whatever little mental ledger you've been keeping, it ends tonight. You go back to your section, you finish your shift, and tomorrow you come in and you don't ask any more questions. And if you can do that," he released her arm, smoothing the gesture into something almost casual, "then we have no problem." Mara looked at him for a long moment. "I documented it," she said. "The dates, the tables, the discrepancy amounts. It's all written down." The color left Franklin's face so quickly it was almost interesting to watch. "I beg your pardon? I've been keeping records." She had in that notebook at home. "For 6 months, I wasn't sure what to do with them, but I know what I have." That was when he grabbed her wrist again, and this time there was no pretense of cordiality, no performance of calm authority. He moved fast and with real force, and his voice had dropped to something that was barely a voice at all, just pressure applied to air. "You're going to come with me right now, and we are going to talk about what you think you have and what it would cost you to make that information disappear, and you are going to listen very carefully because I have been doing this for 3 years without a single problem, and you are 22 years old and you have no idea." "Let her go." The voice came from behind Franklin. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the particular weight of a voice that had never once in its life needed volume to be obeyed. 2 words spoken with perfect evenness, and the hallway went so quiet that Mara could hear the clink of glassware from the dining room 40 feet away. Franklin went still. He didn't turn around immediately. She watched him process the voice, watch the recognition move through him like ice water, watch the confidence drain out of his body with a speed that was almost physical, like air leaving a punctured tire. When he finally turned, it was slow. the kind of slow a man uses when he's buying himself time to compose his face. Alessandro Moretti was standing at the far end of the hallway. He wasn't particularly imposing in the physical sense, not much taller than 6 feet, lean, rather than broad, dressed in a dark suit so understated it bordered on austere. He was somewhere in his early 40s, with a face that was handsome in the severe, angular way of a man who had never bothered to soften his edges. His hands were in his pockets. He wasn't moving. He was simply present in the complete and total way that some people are present, as though the space around him had reorganized itself to acknowledge his authority. Behind him, 2 men had materialized from the direction of the private bar. They weren't doing anything visible. They were just there. Mr. Moretti, Franklin said. His voice had changed entirely. The authority was gone. What was left sounded younger and more afraid. I didn't realize. I apologize. We were just... I heard what you were doing. Alessandro's gaze moved past Franklin. It landed on Mara. She had the strange sensation of being seen in a way she wasn't accustomed to, not assessed for attractiveness or evaluated for usefulness, but genuinely observed the way a person looks at something they find unexpectedly significant. Then he looked back at Franklin. Step away from her. Franklin stepped away. Further. He stepped further. Alessandro walked toward them at an unhurried pace, and with every step he took, Franklin seemed to shrink incrementally, a process so visible it would have been almost comic under different circumstances. He stopped between them, not aggressively, not in a way that manufactured drama. He just placed himself there, and that placement meant everything. Do you know who owns this restaurant? Alessandro asked Franklin. Franklin's jaw worked. Yes, sir. Say it. You do. You own Loro. That's correct. Alessandro turned to look at the 2 men who had followed him out. He said nothing to them. One of them moved to Franklin's side and put a hand on his shoulder. Not hard, just definitive. Franklin is going to go with Marcus for a few minutes, Alessandro said, addressing no one in particular. And you, he turned back to Mara, are going to take a breath. Mara realized she hadn't been breathing normally for several minutes. She exhaled. Franklin was already gone. She hadn't even registered the moment he'd been walked away. It had happened in her peripheral vision while she was too busy staring at the man in front of her, trying to make sense of the situation she'd found herself in. Alessandro Moretti. She knew the name vaguely, the way you knew the names of people who own things. You didn't see those people usually. They existed at a remove in boardrooms, in the backs of cars, in the private dining rooms with the frosted glass. You didn't find yourself standing 2 feet from them in a back hallway while your wrists throbbed and a drop tray of appetizers lay scattered across the floor behind you. Are you hurt? He asked. No, She paused. My wrist is a little... She stopped herself. I'm fine. He looked at her wrist without making any move toward it. You should have the kitchen put some ice on that. I'm fine, she said again. And then, because she could not stop herself, because 6 months of accumulated pressure was still moving through her system looking for an exit. How long have you been back there? In the bar, the faintest shift in his expression, something that might have been the precursor to a smile. Long enough to hear what I said to him. Most of it. She didn't know exactly what to do with that. She was still processing the fact that she was alive and standing upright, and Franklin was somewhere else, and the person in front of her was apparently the man who owned the building she was standing in, and he had just intervened on her behalf, and she had absolutely no framework for what happened next. You said you've been keeping records, Alessandro said. Mara looked at him carefully. I did say that. 6 months of records. Yes. He studied her for a moment. Why? The question caught her off guard. Not the content of it. She'd expected some version of the question, expected someone to ask eventually, but the way he asked it, without accusation, without the edge of a man trying to catch her in something. He sounded genuinely curious. Because it bothered me, she said. That's it. Is that not enough? He was quiet for a beat. Most people in your position would have looked the other way. I know. She'd watched most people in her position look the other way for 6 months. She'd almost been most people. I'm not built that way, I guess. No, Alessandro said, as though confirming something he had already suspected. I can see that. There was something in the way he looked at her that she couldn't quite name. She was used to being looked through by the people who ran this restaurant. Franklin's version of looking at her had always felt like inventory gauging what she was worth, where she could be useful, what she might cost him. This was different. This felt more like being read, which was in its own way more unsettling. He's been doing this for 3 years, Mara said. At least. I only started noticing 6 months ago, so I can only document what I've seen since then. But some of the patterns, the way the inventory doesn't line up, it goes back further than I can trace. I know how long he's been doing it. She blinked. I've known for some time. He said it without inflection, without the defensive posture of a man caught in negligence. Just a fact delivered plainly. Then why? She caught herself. Why didn't I do something sooner? It wasn't a question. He was completing her thought for her, and he didn't seem bothered by it. Because knowing something and having what you need to act on it are two different things. I needed documentation. Paper. A trail that could survive legal scrutiny and couldn't be explained away by a competent attorney. He paused. I needed someone inside who could give me that without tipping their hand. Mara felt something settle in the room. Some shift in the atmosphere, subtle but real, like a change in barometric pressure before a storm. She was starting to understand something, and the understanding was making her stand very still. You knew I'd been keeping records, she said. He didn't answer immediately. You didn't intervene just now because of what Franklin was doing, she said. She wasn't asking anymore. She was working it out in real time, watching his face for confirmation. You intervened because I said out loud in a hallway that I had documentation. And if he'd gotten me into that room, one of two things would have happened. Either he would have frightened me into destroying it, or he would have found a way to make it disappear himself, and then you'd have nothing. Alessandro regarded her without speaking for a long moment. You're very perceptive, he said finally. I'm a waitress. She echoed Franklin's own words back into the air between them, not bitterly, just precisely. I carry plates and I take orders. I've had a lot of time to observe things. Yes, the almost smile again, more visible this time. I noticed that about you. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a card. No name on it, just a phone number printed in small, clean type. He held it out to her. Go finish your shift. Take care of your wrist. Go home tonight and sleep. She took the card. It was heavier than it should have been. Or maybe that was just how it felt. And then, she said, and then we'll talk about what comes next. She turned the card over in her fingers. You're asking me to trust you. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that you don't have to do this alone. Mara looked at the card. She looked at the man in front of her. She thought about the notebook at home, stuffed between her mattress and the bed frame, 6 months of dates and numbers and observations written in her small, careful handwriting. She thought about the Donovan party, the old man leaning toward his wife, the $20 tip that had become $60 in someone else's system. She thought about 14 months of learning to disappear and how tonight she had failed at it spectacularly and completely. I don't know anything about you, she said. I mean, I know the name. I don't know anything real. That's fair. He didn't offer to fill the gap. He simply waited. This card doesn't have a name on it. No, just a number. Yes, she looked up at it, and if I call it what happens, you and I have a conversation in a place that isn't a back hallway, he said, and we decide together what the most effective way forward looks like. She was quiet for a moment. In the dining room behind her, she could hear the rhythm of the restaurant continuing, the low murmur of conversation, the sound of someone ordering, the faint music that played just below the threshold of conscious awareness. All of it exactly as it had been 20 minutes ago, as though nothing had changed. Franklin is going to tell his people I said something tonight, she said. By tomorrow morning, everyone involved will know I've been keeping records. My position here becomes, that's already being handled, Alessandra said. How? Franklin won't be in a position to tell anyone anything by the time you clock out tonight. She absorbed that. She wasn't sure she wanted to know the precise mechanics of what he just told her. But she was sure, and this surprised her, that she believed him. There was no performance in the way he spoke. No reassurance for its own sake. He delivered information the way an engineer delivers load calculations. Here is what will happen. Here is why. Okay, Mara said. Okay, I'll call. She folded the card and slid it into the small pocket of her apron. But I need you to understand something first. He waited. I'm not doing this for money, she said. And I'm not doing this because of whatever it is you're trying to accomplish with the restaurant or the documentation or any of the rest of it. I don't care about any of that. She held his gaze. I'm doing this because those people deserved honest bills. That couple at table 22 last Friday deserved not to be stolen from. All the people who've been stolen from for 3 years deserve better, and nobody did anything about it, and I'm tired of nobody doing anything about it. Alessandro Moretti looked at her for a long, considering moment. Then we have compatible interests, he said. She nodded one. Then she turned, walked back down the hallway, picked up the tray she dropped, and went back to work. She didn't look back, but she felt him watching her all the way to the dining room door. Not the way Franklin had watched her, not like inventory, but the way a man watches something he's just decided is important, something he intends to protect, something he hadn't expected to find in a back hallway of a restaurant he'd been managing from a distance for 3 years. The rest of the shift passed in a strange humming clarity. Her tables were pleasant, her hands were steady. She smiled when she should smile, and recited the specials and refreshed water glasses and processed credit cards, and never once let her face show anything other than the careful, professional composure she'd spent 14 months perfecting. But her mind was elsewhere. Her mind was in a notebook between a mattress and a bed frame. Her mind was on a card with no name and a phone number she'd already memorized. Her mind was on the fact that Alessandro Moretti knew how long the fraud had been happening, that he'd been watching, that he'd been waiting, that he'd been waiting for her specifically, even if he hadn't known it until tonight. And underneath all of it, underneath the calculation and the fear and the exhausted, reluctant courage that had gotten her this far, something else was beginning to take shape. Something that felt against all common sense remarkably close to hope. She took the card out of her apron pocket once just before she clocked out, turned it over, put it back. Then she put her coat on and walked out into the Chicago night, 14 months of invisibility behind her and everything else still ahead. She called the number at 7:43 the following morning. She'd been awake since 4, not the anxious, restless kind of awake where your mind runs in circles, something sharper than that, something focused. She'd sat at her kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her and gone through every entry she'd made over the past 6 months, reading each one like she was reading it for the first time, checking her own logic, testing the gaps. By 6, she'd made coffee. By 7, she'd made her decision. By 7:43, she'd stopped staring at the card and started dialing. It rang once. "I was wondering when you'd call," Alessandro said. No hello, no surprise in his voice, just the same measured calm she'd heard in the hallway, as though he'd been sitting somewhere perfectly still, waiting. "It's Mara," she said. "I know. We need to meet. Today, if possible." She hadn't planned to lead with that, but the words came out with a certainty that surprised her. "I went through the notebook again last night. There's more than I realized. There's a pattern I missed because I was only looking at individual transactions. When you look at it across the full 6 months, there's a secondary layer. Someone above Franklin is setting the allocation numbers before the week begins. He's not inventing the fraud himself. He's executing a number that comes from somewhere else." A beat of silence. "Where are you right now?" Alessandro asked. "My apartment, Wicker Park. There's a coffee shop on Milwaukee Avenue called Henrik's. Do you know it? I can find it. 9 o'clock. He paused. "Bring the notebook." She was there at 8:52. She'd walked because she needed air, and because she thought better when she moved in. By the time she pushed through the door of Henrik's, her mind was clear and her jaw was set, and she felt a particular kind of calm that comes not from the absence of fear, but from having made your peace with it. Alessandro was already there at a corner table with his back to the wall, and a clear line to both the entrance and the side exit. She noticed that without meaning to, and then noticed that she'd noticed it, which told her something. He had a cup of coffee in front of him and a phone face down on the table and nothing else. He looked exactly as he had in the hallway, unhurried, self-contained, dressed simply in dark clothes, except that in daylight he looked slightly more human. Marginally. The severity was still there, baked into the bones of his face, but the restaurant's dim light had made him seem more like a symbol than a person. Morning light made him look like someone who occasionally ate breakfast. She sat down across from him and put the notebook on the table. He looked at it but didn't reach for it. "Tell me what you found," he said. "The billing system at Laurel runs on a weekly allocation model," she said. "The manager enters projected numbers every Monday, how much wine inventory will move, how many covers, what the expected cash-to-card ratio is. Those numbers set the baseline for the week. Everything that comes in above or below the baseline gets flagged for review. She opened the notebook to a page she'd marked. Franklin's been entering the Monday numbers high inflated projections, which means the system expects more revenue than will actually come in. The shortfall at the end of the week is real, but it's covered by the fake charges and the altered receipts. On paper, the restaurant always lands within a few percentage points of the projected number. Alessandra was watching her steadily. Someone has to approve the Monday allocations. Yes, she met his gaze. And it's not Franklin. His authorization level isn't high enough to set the allocation floor. Someone above him is approving those numbers every Monday, and either they don't understand what they're approving, which I doubt, or they know exactly what they're approving, which means Franklin has a partner at a level you probably didn't expect. Something shifted in Alessandro's eyes. Not alarm, she didn't think alarm was in his register, but a sharpening, a recalibration. Say the name, he said quietly. I don't have a name. I have an access code. She turned the notebook toward him and pointed to a column of entries. Every Monday allocation approval carries an authorization code. Same 6 digits every single week for 6 months. I copied them because I thought they might matter. Alessandro picked up the notebook. He looked at the column for a long, measured moment. His face showed nothing. Then he set the notebook down and picked up his phone and typed something and waited. Mara watched him. She could hear the low hum of the coffee shop around them, the grinder running 2 women at the next table laughing about something in the morning traffic bleeding through the windows, and the whole texture of it felt surreal against the weight of what she'd just put on the table. Alessandro looked up from his phone. James Hartley, he said. Mara didn't know the name. Who is he? He sits on the board of the hospitality group that holds the operating license for Loro. Alessandro's voice was even, but something underneath it had gone cold. He's also a city alderman. He's been brokering the lease renewals for 3 restaurant properties I own on the North Shore. A pause. He's the reason I haven't moved against Franklin sooner. Every time my people got close, the trail went nowhere, because the trail began with Hartley, and Hartley had the ability to make trails disappear. Mara processed this. A city alderman has been running a restaurant fraud scheme. He's been doing considerably more than that for considerably longer, Alessandra said. The restaurant is a revenue channel, one of several. The fraud at Loro is clean and contained and never large enough to attract federal attention. It's the kind of operation you run when you want consistent, untraceable income that you can fold into legitimate earnings. He looked at her. You just handed me the link I've been missing for 18 months. She sat with that for a moment. 18 months. She had been unknowingly working inside a money laundering operation for over a year, and a man who had spent 18 months trying to dismantle it had been sitting at the private bar watching the room, and they'd been invisible to each other until a woman who was supposed to stay quiet had stopped staying quiet. What happens now? She said. Now it gets more complicated. He picked up his copy. What you have in that notebook is useful, but it's not sufficient on its own. You're a single witness, and Hartley's attorneys will dismember a handwritten mark on notebook in about 40 minutes. What we need is data directly from the system, the actual authorization logs, the access as them, timestamps, the approval chain. That data exists in Loro's accounting software, which means we need someone inside with system access who can pull it without triggering any alerts. I don't have system access, Mara said. I know, but I know someone who does. He set the cup down. Her name is Diana Reyes. She's the night shift bookkeeper. She's been working at Loro for 2 years, and I believe she's become uncomfortable with what she's been asked to do. I don't have confirmation of that. It's an assessment, not a fact. You want me to approach her? I want you to determine whether she's someone who can be trusted. You know the floor. You know the staff. You know how to read a room. He looked at her steadily. I'm good at a great many things, Mara. Reading a room full of restaurant workers is not one of them. The moment I approach anyone on that staff, the conversation changes. You can get to Diana in a way I cannot. Mara thought about Diana Reyes, quiet woman, maybe 30, almost always working the close. She'd seen her in the back office, head down, always slightly tense across the shoulders in the way people get when they're holding something they'd rather put down. She knows something's wrong, Mara said. I've watched her. She double enters things she's already entered. Checks work, she's already checked. That's not efficiency, that's anxiety. Yes, Alessandro said. That's what I thought. If I approach her and I'm wrong, if she goes straight to Franklin or to Hartley's people, then we adjust. That's a fairly casual way to describe what could happen to me. You're right, I apologize. He said it without performance, straightforwardly. There's genuine risk in talking to Diana. If she's more loyal to the existing arrangement than she appears, it creates exposure. I won't minimize that. What I can tell you is that you won't be doing any of this without support in place. You won't be walking into situations alone. Mara thought about walking into the hallway alone last night, about the sound her tray had made when it hit the floor, about how nobody in the dining room had turned around. I want to know something, she said. He waited. Franklin, last night you said he wouldn't be in a position to say anything by the time I clocked out. What does that mean? Alessandro held her gaze. It means he tendered his resignation last night due to personal reasons effective immediately, and by 9 o'clock this morning he had signed a non-disclosure agreement with terms he found highly motivating to comply with. And if he doesn't comply, then the terms become less favorable. He paused. I'm not going to tell you that no one ever gets hurt in the world I operate in because that would be a lie, and I don't think you'd respect it. What I will tell you is that Franklin Marsh specifically will not be a physical threat to you. I've made that arrangement, and it will hold. She believed him. That was the thing that was hardest to reconcile, how readily she believed a man she'd met less than 15 hours ago whose last name she associated with a category of person her entire upbringing had taught her to treat with extreme caution. But there was something in the way Alessandro operated that was almost anti-manipulative. He didn't reassure her. He didn't make promises that sounded too clean. He told her the edges of things and let her decide what to do with them. And some part of her, the part that had been adding up numbers in secret for 6 months, while everyone around her chose comfortable blindness, recognized that quality and trusted it more than she could fully explain. Okay, she said. I'll talk to Diana. She went back to Loro that evening for her regular shift. Franklin's office was dark. Someone had already removed his name placard from the door, which was a swift efficiency that would have been impressive under other circumstances. The staff had heard pieces of the story. The official version was that Franklin had resigned abruptly for personal reasons, and a temporary manager named Keith had been brought in to cover the transition. Keith was from another property Alessandro apparently owned in River North, and he was professionally pleasant and made no waves and asked no difficult questions, and the floor ran exactly as it always ran. Mara worked her section. She smiled. She refilled water glasses. She put in orders, and she watched Diana Reyes. Diana worked the back office from 8 until close, processing the night's receipts and reconciling the card transactions. She took one break always the same time, always alone, always at the far end of the alley behind the kitchen where nobody smoked anymore since the fire code revision. Mara knew this because she'd spent 2 months on the closing shift and had noticed Diana's patterns the same way she'd noticed all the other patterns. At 9:15, Mara clocked a 10-minute break and went out to the alley. Diana was there. She looked up when Mara came out, and the brief flash of alarm on her face, the instant recalibration, the mask coming down, told Mara everything she'd suspected and more. Hey, Mara said. Hey. Diana exhaled. She wasn't smoking. She just came out here to stand in the cold. Crazy night, huh? With Franklin. Yeah. Mara leaned against the wall beside her. Let the silence sit for a moment. Can I ask you something? Diana's shoulders tightened. Sure. The Monday allocation approvals. Do you process those? A pause that was exactly 1 beat too long. I log them. Yeah, they come in pre-approved. From the authorization code. Another pause. Longer this time. What are you asking me, Mara? Mara turned to look at her directly. I'm asking you if you know what you've been logging. Diana didn't answer. She looked at the wall across the alley instead, and Mara watched the muscles in her jaw work through something private and difficult. Because I've been looking at those codes for 6 months, Mara said. And I think you have too. I think you figured it out a while ago, and I think it's been eating at you. Diana made a sound that was almost a laugh, short and hollow. You need to be really careful, she said. What you're saying right now in this alley tonight, you need to be very careful about where else you say it. I know, but I'm saying it to you. Mara held her ground. Franklin is gone. Whoever comes to fill his slot won't be any different, and you know that. The Monday codes don't come from Franklin. They never did. And that person is not gone. Diana's head turned toward her slowly. You know who it is? I know the authorization code traces to someone on the board. I have a name. Diana stared at her. The guard that had been in her face a moment ago was fracturing at the edges. You need to understand something, she said, her voice dropping to something barely above the ambient sound of the alley. The person whose code that is, he has connections to people who do not respond gently to disruption. I mean that literally. I mean that I have thought about going to the police 3 separate times in the last year, and I have talked myself out of it 3 separate times because you were afraid of what would happen to you. Yes, the word came out raw. I'm afraid too, Mara said. I was afraid last night when I said something to Franklin. Instead of walking away, I was afraid this morning when I picked up my phone. I'm afraid right now in this alley. She paused. But I'm not alone. And if you want to not be alone either, I can introduce you to someone. Diana looked at her for a long moment. The cold air moved between them. What someone? Diana said. The someone who owns this restaurant. The real one, who has been trying to get what we have for a year and a half. Mara watched her face. He's not a comfortable person. I want to be honest about that. But he is pointed in the right direction, and he has resources, and he is serious about this. And I think the two of us, with what I have in writing and what you have in the system, I think we can actually do something. Diana closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, the calculation in her face had shifted into something that looked more like resolve. I can pull the full authorization logs, she said quietly. Every approval, every timestamp, every access instance for the last 3 years. The system keeps an audit trail that nobody has asked me to touch because nobody thought anyone was looking at it. Mara's chest tightened. 3 years, not 6 months. 3 years of documentation sitting in an audit trail that had never been scrubbed because no one had considered it a vulnerability. Can you do it without triggering an alert? If I do it during the regular end-of-night processing window, it looks like routine maintenance. I've done it before for legitimate audits. It won't flag. Tonight, Diana looked at her. You're not messing around, are you? Franklin's gone, and whoever comes next will audit the system configurations. Tonight's the window. Diana looked back at the wall. She exhaled a long breath that hung in the cold air between them. Yeah, she said. Tonight. Mara sent Alessandro a text message at 9:32. 3 words. She said yes. His response came back in under a minute. A single word. Good. By 11:15, Diana had pulled the logs and compressed them into an encrypted file on a drive she'd been carrying in her jacket pocket, and Mara had sent Alessandro the confirmation from the women's restroom on the 2nd floor, the only place in the building without a camera, which she'd confirmed during her 2nd week of employment and filed away as trivia that turned out to be something else entirely. Alessandro responded with an address, not a text this time, a secure message that deleted itself after she read it. She memorized the address in the 8 seconds before it vanished. She went back to her tables. She finished her shift. She split her tips, said goodnight to the kitchen crew, clocked out at midnight. Diana had already gone. Her car was not in the rear lot when Mara came out, which was fine. That was the plan. They didn't leave together. The address Alessandro had sent was a building in the West Loop that looked like a shipping company from the outside and probably was one in addition to whatever else it was. Mara had never been to the West Loop at midnight. She took an Uber and watched the city slide past the window and tried to organize her heartbeat into something manageable. The building's front door opened before she knocked. One of the men from the hallway she recognized the posture held it for her without speaking. Alessandro was inside with 2 other people she hadn't seen before. A man she didn't know with the look of a forensic accountant, slightly rumpled, 3 monitors, takeout containers to one side, and a woman in her late 30s with close-cropped hair and the particular stillness of someone who carried a badge. Mara stopped in the doorway. FBI, she said, looking at the woman. Financial crimes, the woman confirmed. She held out a hand. Special Agent Renata Cruz. We've been building a parallel case on James Hartley for 11 months. Alessandro contacted us 4 days ago with an indication that new evidence might be incoming. She glanced at the drive in Mara's hand. Is that what I think it is? Mara looked at Alessandro. I told you I had resources, he said. She looked back at Agent Cruz. 3 years of authorization logs, including every approval instance tied to Hartley's access code, all within the Loro accounting system. She held out the drive. The bookkeeper who pulled this is willing to cooperate. She'll need protection. That can be arranged, Cruz said. Mara set the drive in her hand, and the moment she let go of it, something in her chest moved. Not relief exactly, not yet, but the first tremor of something that might eventually become relief if the rest of this went the way it needed to go. She pulled out her notebook, set that on the table beside the drive. 6 months of my own records, she said. Handwritten, which I know isn't system data, but it establishes the pattern of behavior from an employee-level perspective and corroborates what's in the digital logs. The dates align. She looked around the table. Tell me what you need next. Special Agent Cruz looked at her for a moment with an expression that was professional and careful, and contained underneath it something that might have been genuine respect. Sit down, she said. We have a lot to go over. Mara sat. Alessandro, standing at the edge of the room with his hands in his pockets, said nothing. But she felt his gaze on the side of her face, and it had the same quality it had carried in the hallway the night before. Not possession, not calculation. Something quieter than either of those things. Like he was watching something he'd been waiting for arrive. They worked until 3 in the morning. Agent Cruz ran the meeting like a surgeon runs an operating room. Precise, economical, no wasted motion. She had a laptop open to a case file that Mara wasn't allowed to see in full, but the sections Cruz did share confirmed what Alessandro had said. The FBI's parallel investigation into James Hartley had been building for nearly a year, targeting a broader network of municipal corruption that stretched well beyond Lauro. The restaurant fraud was a thread, not the whole fabric, but it was a thread Cruz had been trying to grab for months, and what Mara and Diana had handed her was the end of it, clean and pullable. The forensic accountant, his name was Paul, he volunteered it like an afterthought, began cross-referencing the audit logs from Diana's drive against the FBI's existing financial data within 20 minutes of receiving the file. He worked without speaking, 3 monitors, flickering occasionally, making a sound low in his throat that might have been satisfaction or might have been coffee-related. Mara answered Cruz's questions for 2 hours. She answered them the way she'd kept the notebook, precisely without embellishment, sticking to what she had actually observed and separating it clearly from what she had inferred. Cruz had a recorder running and a legal pad beside it, and she wrote things by hand in addition to recording, which Mara respected without being able to fully articulate why. Alessandro sat at the edge of the room for most of it. He didn't interject, didn't add context that hadn't been asked for. When Cruz directed a question to him, he answered it and stopped talking. Mara found herself watching him in the pauses between questions, trying to reconcile the man in this room with the category she'd filed him under since she first heard his name attached to the restaurant. The category kept refusing the reconciliation. At 2:47, Paul looked up from his monitors for the first time in 90 minutes. The authorization code appears 412 times across 3 years of logs, he said. Every Monday without exception. 15 of those instances were approved outside of business hours after 10 p.m. 3 of those fall on dates where Alderman Hartley was on public record as attending out-of-state events. He paused, which means either he has a proxy or he has a system that approves automatically using his credentials, which would be a whole separate category of federal violation. Cruz looked at Alessandro. He's more exposed than we thought. He usually is, Alessandro said. Cruz turned back to Mara. I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. I've given you nothing but honest answers. I know, I need one more. Cruz set down her pen. Your arrangement with Mr. Moretti, the reason you're sitting in this room at 3 in the morning rather than filing a complaint through standard channels, how much of it is voluntary? The question was carefully built, and Mara understood exactly what it was asking underneath the surface version. She looked at Cruz without flinching. All of it, she said. He didn't recruit me. He intervened when my manager was trying to physically coerce me, and afterward he gave me a card and told me to call if I wanted to talk. I called. Everything since has been my decision. Cruz studied her for a moment. Okay, she said. Is there a version of this, Mara said, where I become a liability to the case, where a defense attorney argues that my involvement with Alessandro compromises the integrity of the evidence? Cruz's expression shifted slightly, the faintest acknowledgement that it was a smart question. It's something we'll need to address carefully in how we structure the evidentiary chain. The logs Diana pulled are system data. They exist independently of you, and they were retrieved by a Lauro employee in the course of her ordinary duties. Your notebook is corroborating witness documentation. As long as your testimony is clean, and your relationship with Moretti is accurately characterized, the defense will try that angle and fail. And if they subpoena my communications with Alessandro, then those communications will reflect exactly what you just described to me. A woman who was approached after an incident and chose to cooperate. Cruz held her gaze. Are they going to reflect that? Mara thought about the texts, the 3 words, the deleted message with the address. They'll reflect someone making a judgment call under pressure, she said, which is what happened. Cruz nodded slowly. Get some sleep, she said. We'll be in touch by afternoon tomorrow. Don't go back to Loro until you hear from me. Mara stood. She picked up her notebook. Cruz hadn't asked to keep it, and she hadn't offered. Alessandro was already at the door, and she walked out with him into the empty street, and the cold hit her like a hand pressed flat against her face, and she stopped on the sidewalk and breathed it in because the air inside that building had been running low. You did well in there, Alessandro said. She's thorough, Mara said. Cruz, I liked her. She's very good. He paused. She's also going to try to minimize your role in the final narrative. It'll be cleaner for the prosecution if you're positioned as a passive witness rather than an active participant. Mara looked at him. Does that bother you? It bothers me when accurate things get misrepresented. He said it plainly. You were not passive. I know what I was. She pulled her coat tighter. It doesn't matter what the narrative says. It matters what actually happened. He looked at her for a moment with that quality she'd noticed before, that particular careful attention. How are you getting home? I'll call a car. I'll have Marcus drive you. I don't need Mara. He said her name with the same tone he'd used in the hallway when he'd said, let her go. Not loud, just certain. It's 3 a.m. Let Marcus drive you home. She let Marcus drive her home. She slept for 4 hours. Not well, but deeply, the kind of sleep that comes from complete physical and mental exhaustion that overrides the part of your brain trying to keep you awake and anxious. She woke at 7:30 to a text from a number she didn't recognize that said simply, Diana is safe. Cruz arranged it overnight. Don't worry about her. She stared at the text for a long moment, then she got up and made coffee. Cruz called at 1 p.m. and the call lasted 47 minutes, and by the end of it, the shape of what came next was visible. The FBI was moving quickly, faster than Mara had expected, because Hartley was up for a city council budget vote in 3 weeks that would determine the allocation of a significant amount of public infrastructure funding, and Cruz's team had reason to believe the vote was connected to a second larger layer of the scheme that extended well beyond restaurant billing. Letting Hartley get to that vote would be, in Cruz's understated phrasing, suboptimal. We're looking at a 10-day window, Cruz told her. Within that window, we need Hartley to make contact with someone at Loro in a way that's on record. His pattern has been to conduct all restaurant-related communications through Franklin. Franklin is gone, which creates a gap. Our assessment is that within the next 48 to 72 hours, Hartley will attempt to make contact with whoever is managing the restaurant to ensure operations continue as normal. Keith, Mara said, the temporary manager Alessandro brought in. Yes, Keith Dawson. Alessandro has briefed him. Dawson knows what to say and what not to say. If Hartley makes contact, Dawson will steer him toward a face-to-face meeting rather than a phone conversation, which is what we need. But Cruz paused in a way that meant she was arriving at the uncomfortable part. Dawson may not be sufficient. Hartley knew Franklin personally. He'll be cautious with a new contact. He may want someone he can read, someone who knows the floor, someone who can speak to the day-to-day operations in enough detail to convince him that business is continuing as usual. The pause that followed had a specific shape. Mara recognized its outline. You want me back in the restaurant? Mara said. We want you working your normal shifts, visibly, so that if Hartley does any due diligence, and the staff reports show continuity, nothing's changed except the manager. Everything else is running. And if Hartley comes in person, then you're a waitress doing her job, nothing more. You don't approach him, you don't engage beyond normal courtesy, you do not let him see anything in your face that tells him the room has changed. Cruz paused. Can you do that? Mara thought about 14 months of learning to disappear. Yes, she said, I can do that. She was back at Loro the following evening. The floor felt different without Franklin's presence running underneath it like a current lighter, and at the same time more exposed, the way a room feels after you move out the heaviest piece of furniture and realize how much space it was actually taking up. Keith Dawson ran the pre-shift meeting with quiet competence and zero ego and told the staff that management was reviewing operational structures and that everyone should continue as normal and that any questions about the transition should come to him directly. Nobody asked about Franklin, which told Mara something about how the staff had felt about Franklin that she hadn't fully quantified before. She worked her section. She was good at it. She'd always been good at it, even when she hated it, even when the fraud happening around her made the competence feel complicit. There was something clarifying about doing the work now with a different understanding of why she was there, and she moved through the dining room with a focus that a regular Thursday night wouldn't ordinarily have demanded. Hartley arrived on the second night. She knew him by the way the room responded to him without understanding why it was responding. He was 63, well-dressed, without being flashy, with the rounded, confident ease of a man who had held public office long enough that the performance of approachability had become the actual thing. He came in with two other men and asked for the private dining room, and Keith greeted him, and the private dining room was prepared, and Mara from across the restaurant watched the exchange with her heart making a sound in her chest she was fairly sure wasn't medically typical. She sent a text to the number Cruz had given her. 3 words. "He's here tonight." The response came back in 90 seconds. "We know. Stay your course." She stayed her course. She served her tables. She watched the private dining room from the corner of her eye, the way a person watches a door they know something is going to come through. Halfway through the evening, Keith came to find her in the service corridor. "He wants to meet the senior floor staff," Keith said. His voice was steady, but his eyes were doing the work that his voice wasn't. "He's asking about the transition. Wants to hear from people who've been here. You've been here 14 months. That makes you one of the longest running people on the current floor." Mara looked at him. "He's going to ask me about Franklin." "Probably. And about operations." "Yes." "Does he know my name?" Keith hesitated. "He asked for a list of senior floor staff. Your name was on it." He pointed at it. Something cold moved through her. She kept her face exactly where it was. "Okay," she said. "Give me 2 minutes." She went to the women's restroom, the one without cameras, and stood over the sink and pressed both palms flat on the cool porcelain and looked at herself in the mirror for exactly 60 seconds. She was 22 years old. She had a notebook full of 6 months of numbers. She had a forensic accountant who'd found 412 instances of a crime. She had an FBI agent who picked up the phone within 2 rings. She had a man who had said, "You are not doing this alone," and had so far made that statement factually accurate. She had 14 months of learning to disappear. She was going to use every single one of them. She walked into the private dining room with a small notepad in her hand and a professional smile on her face, and she addressed James Hartley the way she addressed every other person who sat in that restaurant, with complete, quiet, attentive invisibility. "Good evening," she said. "I'm Mara. Is there anything I can get for you gentlemen?" Hartley looked at her with the particular evaluating warmth of a politician who has spent decades making strangers feel seen. "Mara," he said. "Yes, come in. I understand you've been with Lauro for a while." 14 months, she said. "You like it here?" "I do." She meant it in a way he couldn't possibly understand. "The transition with Franklin, has that been hard on the floor staff?" She considered the question with what appeared to be genuine reflection. "Change is always an adjustment," she said, "but Mr. Dawson has been very steady. The team's been fine." And before the transition, anything unusual in the last few weeks, anything that stood out? The room was very quiet. The 2 men with Hartley were looking at something on a phone. Keith was near the door. Mara held Hartley's gaze with the full force of 14 months of practiced blankness and said, "Not that I noticed. It was a normal few weeks. Busy Fridays." She tilted her head slightly. "Should I have been noticing something?" He smiled. It was a good smile practiced down to the muscle memory. No, just making conversation. You know how it is when there's a management transition. You like to check in." He leaned back. "You ever deal with the back office at all? The bookkeeping, the reconciliation reports?" There it was, clean and conversational, and wrapped in the tone of a man asking about the weather. "I ring in my orders, and I run my credit card transactions," Mara said, matching his tone precisely. "The back office is another world to me. I wouldn't know what to do with a reconciliation report." She smiled. "I'm much better with a wine list." Hartley laughed. It was genuine. She had made a man who was about to be federally indicted laugh in the restaurant where he'd been committing fraud for 3 years, and she held a smile and waited. "Fair enough," he said. "You can go ahead and bring another round of whatever my colleagues are having. And thank you, Mara." "Of course," she said. "Enjoy your evening." She walked back out to the service corridor. The adrenaline hit her about 30 seconds after the door closed hard enough that she had to put one hand on the wall. Her breath came out ragged and fast, and she pressed her fist against her sternum and waited for her heartbeat to drop back below something unseemly. Keith appeared beside her. "You okay?" "Give me a second." "You were incredible in there." "Give me a second," she said again. She got herself level. Texted Cruz. He asked about the back office. Direct question wrapped in small talk. I gave him nothing. "Believe me." Cruz, "Good. Are you safe to continue the shift?" Mara, "Yes." Cruz, "He'll leave within the hour. Stay visible until he's gone." She stayed visible. She worked the floor. She ran the wine. She smiled at every table she approached, and she kept Hartley's table in her peripheral vision. And when he finally rose to leave, nearly an hour later, he caught her eye across the restaurant and gave a small, pleasant nod. She returned it. The door closed behind him. 2 days later, Cruz called at 8 in the morning. Her voice had a different texture than it had in the West Loop building, a kind of controlled, forward-leaning energy that Mara had started to associate with events in motion. "Hartley made a call last night," Cruz said, "from a number we've had flagged for 9 months. He called someone in the city planning office who has access to the infrastructure budget documentation. The call was 7 minutes long. We can't share the content of it, but I can tell you that the call has advanced our timeline." "How much?" "We're moving to a grand jury this week. The audit logs your documentation, and 3 additional pieces of evidence from our parallel investigation give us what we need to file. The arrest won't be public for another few days, but the process is beginning." Mara sat very still. "And Franklin has already given a full statement in exchange for a significantly reduced charge. He's been cooperating since 48 hours after his resignation. He gave up Hartley. He gave up Hartley and 2 others we didn't previously have confirmed. Apparently, your confrontation in the hallway accelerated a decision he'd been sitting on for some time." Cruz paused. "People in bad situations sometimes just need the situation to change before they can act. You changed it." Mara said nothing for a moment. Outside her window, Chicago was doing what Chicago did in the early morning, loud and gray, and entirely unconcerned with individual dramas. "What happens to me," she said, "during the trial, my name, my testimony. You'll be listed as a cooperating witness. The defense will depose you. It will be uncomfortable. Alessandro's attorneys will be available to advise you with my full knowledge and approval. Your cooperation with him doesn't change your legal standing as a civilian witness, and I've made that formalization explicit in the case file." Cruz paused. "I also want you to know something for the record, Mara. When we close this case, and we will close it, your role in initiating the evidence chain will be documented fully. In the real record, not just the public version." Mara absorbed that. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. You handed us 412 entries and a live witness, and then you sat across from Hartley and gave him absolutely nothing." Cruz's voice was dry and precise. "I should be thanking you." After the call, Mara sat for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and sent a message to Alessandro. "Cruz says the grand jury is this week." His reply came quickly. "I know. How are you holding up?" She thought about this question. Really thought about it the way you think about questions that deserve actual answers. She typed back, "I think I'm okay. Is that strange?" A pause, then, "No, it means you made the right call." She set the phone down, looked out the window at the gray Chicago morning, thought about a couple at table 22, and a tip that had been altered on their bill, and the particular small violence of being stolen from by someone who was supposed to be trustworthy. She thought about how one decision to stop being quiet could pull a thread, and how a thread pulled at the right angle could start to unravel something enormous. She picked up her phone again. She had a shift in 4 hours. She needed to eat something and get herself together and walk back into that restaurant and do her job. There was still work to do, and the work was not finished, and James Hartley was still sitting in his alderman's office right now, 2 days before a grand jury convened, completely unaware of what was coming. She found that thought, despite everything, deeply satisfying. The grand jury convened on a Tuesday, and Mara wasn't there for it. That was the hardest part. Not the fear, not the waiting, but the specific helplessness of having set something enormous in motion and then being asked to stand at a distance while it moved without you. Cruz had been clear civilian witnesses did not attend grand jury proceedings. Mara went to work, she took orders, she carried plates, she refreshed water glasses. For people who had no idea that 2 floors beneath the alderman's office across the city, a federal prosecutor was laying out 412 instances of authorization fraud in front of 12 people who would decide whether James Hartley spent the next portion of his life in a courtroom. She checked her phone between tables more than she should have. Nothing from Cruz on Tuesday, nothing Tuesday night. She slept badly, and Wednesday morning came in gray and cold with the kind of Chicago wind that doesn't announce itself. It just arrives and takes what it wants. Alessandro called at 9:47 Wednesday morning. The grand jury returned an indictment, he said. Late last night, Hartley, 2 members of his staff, and a city planning official named Reginald Moss, who apparently approved infrastructure contracts in exchange for payments routed through a shell company that Hartley controlled. The restaurant fraud is 1 count among 9. He paused. Cruz will call you this morning. I wanted you to hear it first. Mara was sitting on the edge of her bed. She had her coffee in her hand, and she set it down carefully on the nightstand because her hand had started doing something she didn't want it to do. 9 counts, she said. Wire fraud, tax evasion, bribery of a public official, conspiracy. The restaurant charges are the smallest item on the list, but they're the evidentiary anchor. Your logs, your notebook, Diana's audit pull, everything else the FBI built hangs off the foundation you provided. She pressed her free hand flat against her knee. Is he in custody? He was taken into custody at 6 this morning. His attorney entered a not guilty plea at the arraignment an hour ago. Bail was denied. The judge agreed with Cruz's assessment that he's a flight risk. Alessandro's voice was even, but she'd learned enough of his registers by now to hear what lived underneath the evenness. Satisfaction, clean and certain and long-earned. It's done, Mara. She exhaled. It came out longer than she expected, like something that had been held at pressure for a very long time, releasing all at once. Franklin, she said. Franklin's plea deal was formally entered into the record this morning. 3 years probation, full restitution, permanent bar from working in financial management. He cooperated completely. His testimony is reportedly detailed enough that Hartley's attorney is already looking for a deal. Good. She meant that too, and she meant it without complication. Franklin had been a coward and a thief, and he had put his hands on her in a hallway, and she had not forgotten that. But he had also, when the walls finally closed in, done the right thing. That counted. She was not the kind of person who couldn't hold 2 truths at once. There's a deposition scheduled for you in 3 weeks, Alessandro said. Cruz will walk you through it. I've arranged for the firm I use to have someone available to you not to represent you. You don't need that, just to sit with you during the deposition, so you're not in that room without support. I told Cruz I could handle a deposition. I know you did. I'm not suggesting you can't. I'm suggesting you shouldn't have to do it alone. A beat. You've been doing a great deal alone for a long time. It's a pattern I'd like to interrupt. Mara looked at the window. A pigeon was doing something inadvisable on the ledge outside. She watched it for a moment. Alessandro, she said. Yes. Why did you buy Loro in the first place? A restaurant doesn't seem like, I don't know what your other holdings look like, but a North Shore restaurant seems like a particular choice for someone in your position. A pause, longer than his usual pauses. My mother worked in a restaurant, he said, for 22 years. Not one like Loro, a diner in the South Loop, the kind of place that smells like coffee and bacon from a block away. She worked the breakfast and lunch shifts 6 days a week. She was very good at her job, and she took a great deal of pride in it. Another pause. She was cheated out of 3 years of tip income by an owner who was pocketing a portion of what the customers left. She never knew. I found out after she died. Mara didn't say anything. Laura was an investment, he said, and it was also a statement about what I expect from the people who work for me and what I will not allow. His voice hadn't changed in tone, still level, still controlled, but the weight behind it had shifted into something more personal than she'd heard from him before. When the fraud started, I was angry in a way that was, he paused, choosing the word carefully, specific, because it was your mother's story repeating itself. Yes. She let the silence sit for a moment. It felt like the respectful thing to do. Thank you for telling me that, she said. Thank you for not treating it as a leverage point, he said. Cruz called at 11. The call covered the indictment, the deposition timeline, witness protection protocols, and a procedural question about Mara's employment status at Loro during the trial period that had some potential legal sensitivity. Cruz handled all of it with the same surgical efficiency she'd shown from the beginning, but at the end of the call before she hung up, she said, "You should know that the prosecutor's office is aware of your specific contribution to this case. When this goes to trial, and it will go to trial, Hartley's attorney will not get a deal that satisfies anyone. Your testimony will be treated with the full weight of a material witness, not a peripheral one. You were the origin point. That matters." "It matters that it's on record," Mara said. "I'm less concerned with what it's called." "I know," Cruz said. "That's part of why it matters." She went to work that afternoon. She had told no one on the floor what was happening, not the colleagues she liked, not the kitchen staff who'd been kind to her, not anyone. There had been a quiet among the Loro employees since Franklin's departure and Hartley's visit, the particular quiet of a group of people who sensed that the ground has shifted without knowing the full topography of the change. By the time Mara started her shift, the news of Hartley's arrest had broken publicly, a brief factual statement from the U.S. Attorney's Office picked up by the Tribune and the local television affiliates. She heard two tables discussing it during service. Neither of them connected it to the restaurant they were sitting in. Keith found her in the service corridor between the dinner rush's first and second waves. He looked like a man who had been holding a very heavy thing for several days and had just been told he could set it down. "Is it over?" he said. "The arrest part," she said. "The trial will take a while, but yes, the main thing is done." He let out a breath. "Alessandro called me an hour ago. He said he's coming in tomorrow, that he wants to talk to the full staff." He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on Keith's face before, something quieter than his usual professional composure, something that looked like real feeling. He also said that whatever he tells the staff tomorrow, I should know ahead of time that Loro is going to change. What we've been running under isn't what it was supposed to be, and that the people who stayed through the mess deserve to be part of rebuilding it. He paused. He said specifically that you should be part of that conversation. Mara nodded. "I'll be here tomorrow." "I know you will." Keith looked at her. 14 months, he said. "You've been here 14 months, and I've been running this floor for 3 weeks, and somehow you're the one who did this." "I kept a notebook," she said. "That's not heroic. That's just paying attention." "There are 30 people on this staff," Keith said. "They all paid attention. You're the one who wrote it down." She didn't have an answer for that. She picked up her tray and went back to the floor. Alessandro arrived the following morning at 10 o'clock. He brought no entourage, no legal team, no performance of arrival. He walked through the front door of Loro in a dark coat, nodded at the host stand, and went directly to the main dining room where Keith had assembled the full staff floor kitchen, bar back office, and the chairs pulled out from the tables, the restaurant empty and quiet and smelling of cleaning solution and the night before service. Mara sat in the second row. She hadn't planned that deliberately. She just sat where there was a seat, and the second row was where she ended up, which felt about right. Alessandro stood at the front of the room without a podium or notes. He looked around the assembled staff for a moment before he spoke, and the look wasn't cursory. He actually looked at people individually the way he looked at Mara in the hallway, with the quality of genuine attention. "Most of you know by now that James Hartley was arrested yesterday morning," he said. "Some of you know pieces of why. I'm going to tell you the full version because you deserve it, and because what you do next should be an informed decision, not a guess." He told them, cleanly and completely, starting from the billing fraud and moving through the authorization chain and ending with the indictment. He did not minimize or deflect, and he did not perform contrition for a situation he hadn't created. When he talked about his own role, the 18 months of parallel investigation, the decision to bring Mara into the operation, he described it plainly without framing it as a rescue. "A member of your staff," he said, "noticed what was happening before I had the evidence to act on it. She documented it at personal risk. She identified a link I'd been missing for a year and a half, and she cooperated with federal investigators at a point when walking away would have been the easier and safer choice." He didn't say her name. She was grateful for that. But the staff turned and looked at her anyway. They knew. She wasn't sure how, but they knew. And the look that moved through the room wasn't the look of people assigning credit or distributing curiosity. It was something quieter than that, like witnessing. "Going forward," Alessandro said, Laura is going to operate differently. New financial controls, a fully independent audit structure, and a compensation model for floor staff that removes the parts of the current system that created the incentive for what Franklin ran. He paused. Anyone who wants to leave understands. Anyone who wants to stay has my personal commitment that what they work under will be legitimate, transparent, and fair. I'll be here through the end of this week to answer any questions directly, and Keith will remain as permanent general manager. He looked around the room. That's what I came to say. There was a pause. Then one of the line cooks, a man named Ray, who had worked the kitchen for 4 years and had a voice like a freight elevator, said, "What about back pay for the tip income we lost?" Alessandro looked at him. "I've already begun calculating the discrepancy. You'll each receive documentation within 2 weeks. The restoration will follow." Ray nodded slowly. "All right then," he said. The meeting dispersed in the specific way meetings disperse when the thing said was the thing needed not. With euphoria, not with relief exactly, but with the quiet resolution of people who have been handed a fact they can organize themselves around. Mara stayed after the others filtered out. Alessandra was at the edge of the room, speaking quietly with Keith, and she waited until Keith moved toward the kitchen before she walked over. "You didn't use my name," she said. "You didn't ask me to." "No, but some people would have. It would have been an easy way to frame the story." "The story doesn't need framing," he said. "It needs to be accurate. You know what you did. The people who matter know what you did." He looked at her. "The deposition is 3 weeks out. How are you feeling about it?" "Steadier than I expected," she said honestly. "Good." He paused. "There's something else I want to discuss with you, and I want to do it when you've had time to process the last several days. Not right now, but soon." She studied him. "You're going to offer me something." The almost smile. "I want to offer you a conversation. What comes out of it is up to you." "You're very careful with your language." "I've learned to be," she nodded. "Call me in a few days, after the deposition prep meetings start." "I'll do that." She went home that afternoon and slept for 11 hours, the first real, full sleep she'd had since the hallway. She dreamed nothing. She woke in the dark of early morning, feeling for the first time in a very long time like the weight of her own life was a manageable thing. Not light, she wasn't naive enough to expect it to be light, not with a deposition coming, in a federal trial, and the long grinding administrative aftermath of a thing like this. But manageable, proportionate, like a weight she'd chosen to carry rather than one that had been placed on her without consent. She lay there for a while in the dark, thinking about nothing specific. Then she thought about Diana. She called her at 7:30. Diana picked up on the second ring, and the sound of her voice present, alert, not the tightly wound half-whisper of the alley, was its own piece of information. "I heard," Diana said. "The arrest. I saw it on the news. How are you doing?" A pause that was different from the pauses Diana used to make. Not guarded, just reflective. "I feel like I put something down," she said. "Something I've been carrying so long, I forgot it wasn't part of me." Another pause. "I'm going to need to testify." "So am I. Cruz is good. She'll prepare us." I know that." A breath. "I'm glad you came out to that alley, Mara. I was so close to talking myself out of it again. For the 4th time. And then you were there saying what I'd been thinking for a year out loud in the cold, like it was simply the next obvious thing to say." "It was the next obvious thing to say," Mara said. Diana laughed, and the laugh was real and full, and entirely unlike anything Mara had heard from her in 14 months of working the same building. "Yeah," she said. "I guess it was." After she hung up, Mara made coffee and sat at her kitchen table with the notebook. She hadn't opened it since the night in the West Loop building. She opened it now and turned through the pages, slowly reading the entries, not as evidence, but as a record of her own attention. Every date, every transaction, every discrepancy logged in her careful handwriting on a weeknight after a long shift when she was tired and afraid and could have simply not done it, but did it anyway because something in her constitution would not allow the alternative. She got to the last entry, the Donovan party, table 22, the $20 tip that became 60 in the system. She thought about that couple, the man with the hearing aid, the way he leaned toward his wife to catch what she said, the look on their faces when they toasted whatever it was they were celebrating. She'd never know their first names. She'd never be able to tell them what their $20 tip had set in motion. That they'd left a restaurant that night while an alderman's 3-year operation was already one decision away from unraveling, and that the person who made that decision had been standing at their table 10 minutes before pouring their water. She closed the notebook. Outside, Chicago was waking up. She could hear it through the window, the traffic in the siren and the particular low-register sound the city made in the early morning, like an engine warming up. She had a deposition in 3 weeks. She had a trial after that. She had a conversation with Alessandro that he'd been careful not to define yet. She had a life that 2 weeks ago had been arranged around disappearing. She picked up her phone. She had 3 unread messages, one from her mother, one from a college friend. She'd been out of touch with, one from a number she didn't recognize. She opened the unknown one last. It was a Tribune reporter named Garrett Mills. He had somehow gotten her number. She was going to ask Cruz how that had happened, and his message was professional and brief. He was writing a piece on the Hartley indictment. He'd heard that a Loro employee had been central to the evidence development. He wasn't going to use her name without permission. He was asking for a conversation. She read the message 3 times. Then she set the phone down and looked out the window. A reporter. The public version of the story, which Cruz had said would position her as a passive witness, was about to be told by someone who apparently had better information than the official narrative. If she ignored Garrett Mills, he would write what he had without her. If she talked to him, she shaped what he wrote. If she shaped what he wrote, her name was in a newspaper that James Hartley's attorney would read before the trial. She picked up the phone and called Cruz. Cruz answered in one ring. "I was about to call you," she said. "You got the Mills message. How did he get my number?" "We're looking into that. My recommendation is that you don't respond to him until after the deposition. At that point, it's your call legally and personally. Your name isn't protected from being reported, but I'd strongly advise against any public statement before testimony." A pause. "Alessandro's team is also aware. He'll probably reach out. He already said he'd call in a few days. Then you'll have a full picture by the time you need to make a decision." Cruz's voice had the crisp steadiness Mara had come to depend on. "For right now, don't respond to Mills. Go live your life. You've earned a few days of extremely ordinary existence." Mara almost laughed. "Yeah," she said. "I think I have." She made herself breakfast. She took a walk along the river because the wind had let up and the morning had turned unexpectedly bright, the kind of October light that Chicago gave you like a gift, right before it took everything back for winter. She walked for an hour without her phone in her hand and let her mind run quiet for the first time in what felt like months, and she watched the river and the people running along it and the skyline above everything enormous and indifferent and somehow comforting in its indifference. She thought about what Keith had said. 14 months and she was the one who wrote it down. She thought about what Cruz had said. You were the origin point. She thought about what Alessandro had said about his mother, the South Loop diner, the breakfast shift, 6 days a week, 22 years, the tip income that had been quietly stolen from a woman who never knew. She thought about how many Marichens had been in how many hallways and said nothing. Not because they didn't see it, not because they didn't know, because they had done the same arithmetic she'd done every day for 6 months and arrived at the same conclusion that the cost of speaking was greater than the cost of silence, and that the math was simply the math and there was no point fighting math. She thought about the moment the arithmetic had changed for her. It wasn't the Donovan party, she realized. Not really. The Donovan party had been the trigger, but the thing underneath it, the thing that had been building for 6 months, maybe for her whole life, was simpler and older than a single table. It was the recognition that silence had a cost too. That every day you carried something you should have put down, it got heavier. That the weight accumulated in ways that didn't show on the outside, but bent something on the inside over time slowly, until the bend became permanent and you forgot what straight had felt like. She had not wanted to forget what straight felt like. That was all. That was the whole of it. Not heroism, not even principle really, just a refusal to let the weight finish its work. She walked back to her apartment as the morning tipped into noon, and she felt the city around her as something she was part of rather than something she was moving through. And when she got to her door and put her key in the lock, she paused for a moment on the threshold, her hand on the frame, and thought very clearly and without drama, I am still here. She was still here, and Hartley was in custody, and somewhere across the city, A grand jury had done its work, and Diana was putting something down that she'd been carrying for a year, and Franklin was going to spend the next portion of his life accounting for what he'd taken, and the Donovan party, wherever they were, would never know what their ordinary Friday dinner had started. And Mara Chen, 22 years old, former practitioner of high-quality invisibility, walked into her apartment and closed the door behind her. She had a deposition in 3 weeks, a reporter who needed to wait a conversation with Alessandro she hadn't had yet, in a life that was entirely, completely, and for the first time in a long time, her own to define. She sat down at her kitchen table, opened her laptop, and for the first time since she could remember, had no idea what came next. It turned out that not knowing felt nothing like fear. It felt like a door that had just opened. It felt like walking out of a hallway where someone had grabbed her arm into a restaurant that was hers to serve as long as she wanted it, into a city that didn't know her name yet. It felt like the moment just before everything changed, again. Alessandro called 4 days later on a Saturday morning and asked if she'd meet him at Loro before the lunch service began. She said yes before she'd finished processing the request. The restaurant was quiet at 9:30 in the way restaurants are quiet before service, the particular held breath stillness of a room that knows what it's for but hasn't started being it yet. The kitchen crew was prepping in the back, the low percussion of knives and pans bleeding through the service door, and a single light was on above the bar, where Alessandro sat with 2 cups of coffee already poured. He had a folder on the table beside him. She noticed it but didn't ask about it yet. She sat down, took the coffee, and waited. Hartley's attorney filed a motion to suppress the audit logs this week, Alessandro said. The argument is that Diana didn't have explicit authorization to export system data. Mara felt something tighten in her chest. Cruz told me. She also told you it's unlikely to succeed. She said the motion had a low probability of success. That's not the same thing. No, he agreed, it isn't. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. Hartley's strategy is delay and erosion. He'll file motions, challenge witnesses, attack the chain of custody on every piece of evidence, and drag the process out long enough that something shifts. Witness gets tired, a piece of documentation gets successfully challenged, public attention moves somewhere else, and the political will to prosecute diminishes. He looked at her directly. He's done it before. He beat a bribery charge 8 years ago through exactly this method. Cruz knows all of this. Cruz knows it, and she's the best financial crimes prosecutor in the Northern District of Illinois, and she's going to win. He said it without drama, as a fact with weight behind it. But the process is going to be longer and harder than the clean version of the story. I want you to know that before you make any decisions. What decisions? He opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, not a contract, not a legal document, just a typed page with a few paragraphs and a line at the bottom for a signature. He turned it toward her and let her read it. It was an offer of employment. The title read Director of Operational Integrity, Moretti Hospitality Group. The salary listed made her blink once and then read it again to confirm she'd parsed the number correctly. She set the page down. You're offering me a job, she said. I'm offering you a position that didn't exist before you, he said. Operational integrity means exactly what it sounds like: oversight of financial and ethical compliance across the group's properties. Currently 12 restaurants and 4 event venues in Chicago, 2 more in development. He paused. What you did at Loro, the pattern, recognition, the documentation methodology, the ability to identify a secondary authorization layer that my own people had missed. Those aren't waitressing skills. They're investigative skills, analytical skills, the kind of skills I've been paying outside consultants significant amounts of money to approximate and never fully achieve, because the outside consultant doesn't work. The floor doesn't know the room, can't read the people the way someone who's been inside the operation can. Mara looked at him for a long moment. I'm 22, she said. I have a 1.5 years of college credit, no degree, and 14 months of restaurant experience. I know your resume. I'm not trying to undersell myself. I'm trying to give you the accurate picture. If I walk into a meeting with your CFO and your property managers and I present as the new Director of Operational Integrity, they're going to spend the first several months not taking me seriously. You know that. Yes, he said. I do know that. And you're offering this anyway. I'm offering it because the people who dismiss you based on your age and your title have a consistent track record, in my experience, of being precisely the kind of people who benefit from having someone in the room who they've decided not to watch. His voice was dry. You are very good at being underestimated. I'd rather pay you to use that deliberately than watch it happen to you accidentally. She looked at the page again. The salary figure, the title, the line at the bottom waiting for her name. I need to think about it, she said. Of course. And I need to talk to Cruz. Make sure accepting this doesn't create any appearance issues with my witness status in the trial. I've already asked her, informally. Her position is that your employment relationship with me exists independently of your role as a cooperating witness, provided the work you do is legitimate and the compensation is documented and above board. He paused. Everything in that offer is documented and above board. I know, she said. And she did know, which was still a strange thing to reconcile with everything she'd understood the word Moretti to mean before she'd met the person it belonged to. Can I ask you something directly? You always do. Is part of this because you feel responsible for me? Because I got pulled into something that originated in your restaurant and your failure to act sooner gave Hartley and Franklin years they shouldn't have had? The question landed in the room and sat there. Alessandro looked at it for a moment before he answered. Yes, he said, that's part of it. I'd be lying if I told you otherwise, and I don't intend to lie to you. He held her gaze. But responsibility and recognition are not mutually exclusive. A person can feel accountable for a situation and also correctly identify that the person who navigated it has demonstrated something real. He paused. My mother worked in a restaurant for 22 years. She was good at her job. She was honest. She had standards that the people around her frequently failed to match. She was never offered anything beyond what the job description said. Not because she didn't deserve more, but because no one was paying attention. A beat of silence. I'm paying attention, Mara. She looked at the page. She thought about her apartment in Wicker Park, the mattress with the notebook that wasn't between it and the bed frame anymore, the kitchen table where she drunk coffee at 4 a.m. and made the decision to dial a number with no name on the card. She thought about the river walk, the October light, the feeling of not knowing what came next and discovering that it felt like a door opening rather than a door closing. She thought about Diana, who had pulled an audit trail in a 20-minute window because someone had come out to an alley and said the thing out loud that she'd been thinking alone for a year. She thought about the Donovan party. She looked up. I need 2 weeks, she said. Let me get through the deposition, get a clearer picture of what the trial schedule looks like, and make sure I understand what the role actually requires day to day. Then I'll give you an answer. 2 weeks, he said. That's reasonable. And if I say yes, she said, I want it understood from the beginning that I operate independently. I report to you, but I make my own assessments. If I identify a problem in one of your properties, I document it and I bring it to you directly, and I expect it to be acted on. I don't want a title that means something on paper and nothing on the floor. That's exactly what the role is meant to be. I want it in writing. Alessandro picked up a pen from the table and made a notation in the margin of the page, then initialed it. It's in writing, he said. She almost smiled. Okay. She left Loro at 10:15 and walked 4 blocks before her phone buzzed with a text from Diana. Can you talk? She called immediately. Diana picked up in one ring. Something happened, Diana said. Her voice was controlled, but underneath it was the vibration of someone holding something tight. I got a call this morning, unknown number, male voice. He didn't threaten me directly. He was very careful about that. He said he was calling on behalf of people who were concerned about the direction of the case and that it would be in my interest to reflect carefully on the accuracy of my recollections before the deposition. Mara stopped walking. Witness tampering. That's what it sounds like to me. I recorded the call. Diana paused. My phone records it automatically. I didn't set it up for this. I've always had it enabled. I'm paranoid about things being said and then denied. Diana, that recording is evidence. Call Cruz right now, not after this call, right now. I know that. A breath. I just needed to tell someone first. I needed to. Her voice caught for just a moment. I needed to hear that I'm doing the right thing. You're doing the right thing, Mara said. You've been doing the right thing since the alley. This call you just got, it means they're scared. They're scared enough to do something stupid. That's not a sign that you should stop. That's a sign that what you have is working. A pause. You sound so sure. I am sure. Call Cruz. Mara paused. And Diana, where are you right now? My apartment. Don't go anywhere alone until Cruz tells you it's handled. Text me when you've reached her. Okay, another breath, steadier this time. Okay, thank you. Mara called Alessandro the moment she hung up. He answered in 4 seconds. Someone called Diana this morning, she said. Witness intimidation careful but clear. She recorded it. She heard the quality of his silence change. I'll call Cruz. I'm calling her next. I wanted you to know first because if Hartley's people are making contact with witnesses, the timeline of the whole thing may be changing. It changes in our favor, Alessandro said. Witness tampering on a recorded line is a separate federal offense. Hartley's attorney is going to have a very bad afternoon. He was right. Cruz's reaction when Mara reached her 11 minutes later had the controlled intensity of a prosecutor who has just been handed something she didn't ask for and immediately understood the value of. Where is Diana now, was the first thing Cruz said. Her apartment. I'm sending someone to her in the next 30 minutes. She needs to send me that recording immediately before she does anything else. Cruz's voice was moving fast-clipped. This is a gift, Mara. I know it doesn't feel like one from where you're standing, but what just happened is Hartley's team panicking. People who are confident they're going to win don't make calls like this. They've seen the evidence and they know what they have and they're frightened. That's what I told Diana. Good. Keep telling her that. A pause. Are you okay? The question landed with a gentleness that Cruz didn't often deploy and it caught Mara slightly off guard. I'm fine, she said. And then I'm angry. There's a woman who spent a year terrified to do the right thing, finally did it, and now someone called her apartment at 9 in the morning to try to scare her back into silence. I know, Cruz said. Hold on to that anger. It'll serve you well in the deposition. The deposition happened 10 days later in a conference room in the federal building on Dearborn Street. Mara wore the same dark blouse she'd worn to every serious conversation she'd had in the last month, because she'd learned that what she wore on the outside had some effect on the quality of stillness she could access on the inside. Alessandro's attorney, a composed woman named Sylvia Park, who had the posture of someone who had never in her life been caught off guard, sat beside her and said almost nothing throughout the entire proceeding, which was Mara came to understand precisely the right amount. Hartley's attorney was a man named Gerald Fossey, who had a large reputation and a technique that relied heavily on making witnesses feel they had contradicted themselves when they hadn't. He tried it on Mara for 2 hours. She gave him nothing. Every question she answered precisely and completely and stopped talking the moment her answer was complete. And when he attempted to paraphrase her responses in ways that shifted their meaning, she corrected him quietly and without visible irritation. And when he challenged her notebook's accuracy, she walked him through the methodology she'd used to cross-reference her entries with the printed receipts she'd kept copies of. And by the end of the second hour, something had shifted in Foss's approach. It became slightly less aggressive and slightly more exploratory, the adjustment a skilled attorney makes when he realizes the witness cannot be rattled. When it was over, Sylvia Park gathered her papers and said in the tone of someone who doesn't give assessments casually, "That was a 10 out of 10. Mara said, 'Can we get coffee? My hands are shaking, and I don't want anyone to see.'" Sylvia Park smiled for what Mara suspected was the first time that day. "Absolutely," she said. The trial began 6 weeks later. It ran for 19 days. Mara testified on day 8. She sat in the witness box in the same deliberate stillness she'd maintained throughout everything that had come before, and she told the truth about what she had observed and documented in the same precise, unembellished way she had been telling it since the night in the West Loop building. Fossey cross-examined her for 90 minutes. She gave him the same nothing she'd given him in the deposition, and the jury watched her do it, and she watched the jury watching her, and she understood without being told that the quality of her stillness was communicating something that the content of her answers alone could not. Diana testified on day 11. She was visibly nervous going in. Mara saw her in the corridor outside the courtroom, hands pressed flat against her thighs, and Mara put a hand on her arm and said simply, "You know what you know. Just say what you know." Diana had nodded and walked into the courtroom and delivered one of the cleaner testimonies Cruz later said she'd seen from a civilian witness, including a detailed explanation of the authorization log extraction process that left Fossey with nothing productive to challenge. The recorded witness tampering call was admitted into evidence on day 14 over Fossey's objection. The jury heard it played back in that quiet courtroom, a man's voice careful and measured and unmistakably threatening, telling a woman to reconsider her recollections. The impact of it in the room was physical. Mara, sitting in the gallery, watched two jurors exchange a look that contained an entire verdict. Hartley's team rested without calling him to testify. That told Mara everything. The jury deliberated for 9 hours across 2 days. The verdict came back on a Thursday afternoon, guilty on 7 of 9 counts, including wire fraud, tax evasion, bribery of a public official, and conspiracy. The 2 counts they acquitted on were the smallest and most peripheral, and even Fossey, reading the verdict with the professional composure of a man absorbing a professional catastrophe, couldn't find much to work with in the partial outcome. Sentencing was scheduled for 60 days out. Cruz's office projected 12 to 15 years. Mara heard the verdict in the hallway outside the courtroom on her phone, Cruz reading the counts as they came through. She was there alone. She had chosen to be. She'd watched the closing arguments from the gallery the day before and hadn't wanted to be in a room full of people when the number came in. She wanted to be somewhere she could let her face do whatever it needed to do without an audience. What it needed to do, it turned out, was nothing dramatic. No tears, no exhale of held breath. Just a long, quiet moment where she stood with her back against the wall of a federal building hallway and thought about a notebook between a mattress and a bed frame and a card with no name and an alley in October and a couple at table 22 who had left a $20 tip that someone had changed to $60, and how far and how fast a single decision can carry a person if they don't flinch when it matters. She texted Alessandro, guilty. 7 counts. His response, I know. Are you all right? She typed back, yes, I think I actually am. She called her mother for the first time in 3 weeks. Her mother cried, which Mara had expected. She cried for both of them, really for the fear she'd held for her daughter that she hadn't been told the full extent of until it was over, and for the particular complicated pride of watching someone you raised become someone who did the thing you always hoped they would, but were never quite sure they could. You could have been hurt, her mother said. I know, and you did it anyway. I had help. You were the one who kept the notebook, her mother said, echoing Keith's words from weeks ago in a way that made Mara smile into the phone. Nobody else kept a notebook. Yeah, Mara said. Nobody else kept a notebook. She called Alessandro back the following morning and told him she was taking the job. He said, good. No celebration, no performance of pleasure, just a single word delivered with a weight that was its own form of acknowledgement. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. I have one condition I forgot to mention, she said. What is it? Diana, she needs to be placed in a role that matches what she did. She pulled that audit trail. She took the same risk I did. She's a better bookkeeper than she's been allowed to demonstrate because she's spent 2 years executing someone else's fraud instead of doing legitimate work. I want her at the Moretti Group. Whatever position makes sense for her skills, I'll leave that to you, but I want her in the building. A pause. Done, Alessandro said. That was fast. It was obvious. I should have offered it before you asked. He paused. Is there anything else? She thought about it seriously. Not today, she said. I'll develop a list. He did something she hadn't heard from him before, a short, genuine laugh, real and unguarded, the laugh of someone who has been caught off guard in a pleasant way. It made him sound like an entirely different person for 3 seconds, and then he was himself again, and she was herself again. And the conversation ended with the particular comfortable economy of 2 people who have been through something real together and don't need to perform around each other. She started at the Moretti Group 3 weeks later. She wore the dark blouse. She sat in her first meeting with the CFO and 2 property managers, and she watched them clock her age, her face, the title on the agenda sheet, and make precisely the calculations she'd predicted to Alessandro. She was 22. She was unknown. She was the new director who existed because the boss said so, and she could be safely managed around. She let them think that for approximately 20 minutes. Then she put 3 documents on the table, a preliminary compliance analysis she'd run on 2 of the group's properties using publicly available billing records, and a methodology she'd developed from her own notebook. And she walked the room through what she'd found with the same precision she'd walked a federal prosecutor through 6 months of restaurant fraud. The CFO said nothing for a long moment when she finished. Then he said, "How long did this take you?" "In 4 days," she said. "I wasn't working full-time on it. I was still finishing up some trial-related obligations. Give me a full week on a property and I can go considerably deeper." Another silence. And then the CFO picked up one of the documents and started actually reading it the way people read things when they've stopped performing skepticism and started paying attention. That was enough. That was exactly enough. She texted Alessandro after the meeting, "I think we're going to be fine." He replied, "I never doubted it." Diana started 2 weeks after that as senior financial analyst. On her first day, Mara walked her through the building and introduced her to the team and showed her the desk that would be hers and watched Diana sit down in the chair and run her hands along the edge of the desk with the quiet, deliberate satisfaction of someone touching something they've earned. "This is real," Diana said. "This is very real," Mara said. "A year ago, I was sitting in a back office, entering numbers that I knew were wrong, and telling myself there was nothing I could do about it. And now you're here," Diana looked up at her, "because you came out to that alley. Because you were already thinking about going out to the alley," Mara said. "I just showed up while you were thinking about it." Diana shook her head, but she was smiling. "Take the credit, Mara. You've earned it." Mara sat on the edge of the desk. She thought about that, about credit and what it meant, and whether it was something you took or something that simply accumulated around you when you stopped worrying about it. She thought about the hallway, the sound of her tray on the floor, the voice that had come from the far end of the corridor with the perfect weight of someone who had never needed volume to be obeyed, the card with no name, the 7:43 phone call, the notebook, the alley, the conference room in the West Loop, the deposition, the verdict. She thought about all of it as one continuous thing, not a series of events, but a single movement, like a piece of music that starts with one note and builds, and you don't know what it's going to become until it becomes it, and then you realize the whole shape of it was there in the first note all along. James Hartley was sentenced 14 weeks later to 13 years in federal prison. The sentencing hearing was covered by 3 television stations, and the Tribune ran it above the fold. Garrett Mills, the reporter who had messaged Mara months ago, wrote the definitive account of the case, and with Cruz's approval and Alessandro's counsel, Mara had agreed to speak with him on background, not for attribution, not with her name in print, just the accurate version of how the evidence chain had been built so that the public record of the story was true. Mills had asked her at the end of their conversation what she wanted people to take from it. She had thought about that for a long moment. "I want people to understand that the notebook was the whole thing," she said. "Not anything dramatic, not anything that required special courage or special ability. I wrote down what I saw on weeknights when I was tired in a notebook I kept under my mattress because I didn't know what else to do with it. I kept it because I couldn't stop noticing, and I couldn't stop caring, and I couldn't find a way to be comfortable with silence." She paused. Anyone can keep a notebook. Anyone who's paying attention and can't stop paying attention and refuses to let the weight finish its work, anyone like that can do what I did. Mills had not used that in print. What he wrote instead was careful and factual and accurate, which was what she'd asked for. But she didn't forget the words. She carried them with her into the new work, into the meetings and the property reviews, and the compliance analyses, into the daily practice of paying attention in rooms full of people who had decided not to watch. She was 22 years old. She had a title on a door and a salary that still made her blink when she looked at the direct deposit and a colleague named Diana who laughed like someone who had put something down, and a complicated and serious man who had once said, "You are not doing this alone," and had made every syllable of it true. She had a notebook still, though it was a new one, now clean pages, same careful handwriting, same methodology of looking at a number and asking whether it matched what she had actually seen with her own eyes. She had a life that was entirely, completely, irrevocably her own. And she had the certain knowledge carried quietly and without fanfare that a 22-year-old waitress who refused to look the other way had walked into a back hallway one Friday night, said the thing that needed to be said to a man who thought she had no power, and brought down an alderman with a notebook and 14 months of practice at being in the room without being seen. Mara Chen had never been invisible. She had simply been waiting for the moment when being seen was finally worth the cost. That moment had arrived and she had met it, and she had not looked away.